May 18th, 1827. Morning pooled in the lanes of Polstead like milk. The hedgerows wore pearls of dew, and skylarks practiced the art of pretending that nothing in this world could be wrong. It was a Friday. It was the sort of pastoral English morning that poetry lies about and painters flatter. In this light, a village believes itself innocent. Carts creaked, doors yawned. Some children ran to the pump with tin pails that flashed like fish. By noon, a young woman named Maria Marten tied up her hair with ordinary fingers, and an idea that must have felt like oxygen. Escape. She had arranged to meet her lover, William, near the building everyone called the Red Barn. The barn was not entirely red anymore. Time, weather, and a habit of looking away had sanded it down to a colour that could pass as respectable brown. But everyone kept the old name. Everyone keeps names for the things they pretend not to see. Maria wore a dress that did not announce elopement, did not declare the shiver under her breastbone, did not betray that she had rehearsed every step from her father's cottage to the barn by candlelight. She was patient and stubborn. She had learned the map of the fields by heart. If someone asked, she was going to Sudbury. If someone looked too long, she lowered her eyes politely. She moved like someone walking through a dream she had created for herself. At the barn, the air breathed hay. The wind wrote its silences through gaps in the boards. Somewhere, a cow lowed as if reading a line in a prayer book. Maria arrived first and stood in the threshold, a figure on the seam between daylight and the barn's red half-dark. She waited. She waited long enough for hope to fray and retie itself, then fray again. When William arrived, he carried something in his face that did not match the spring. He smiled. He said her name the way one might say a rope's name before pulling. That same afternoon, in another house in Polstead, a woman sat with a needle in her hand and found it suddenly foolish. Anne Marten, Maria's stepmother, was not prone to visions. Her life had contained enough labour to squeeze magic out of the hours. But the light tilted. The room became a corridor, and into that corridor came a smell like wet earth, and a sense of standing in a doorway she could not see. She blinked, and it passed. By nightfall, the village folded itself tightly, as if to keep dusk from leaking. No announcement was made. No bells rang. There is no ceremony for the first time a life goes missing. Days became weeks. News floated down the lanes. Maria had eloped, or she had gone to London, or she had tired of the village and taken to the road. Each story felt like a blanket thrown over a shape in a corner. William, if asked, looked mournful and relieved, as if humility and mercy had shaken hands. He said he had heard from her once. He said she was well. He said a great many careful, useful things. Then the dreams began. They came like weather, one after another, a procession of nights with the same visitor. In the dreams, Maria stood at the threshold of that barn, with her brightness slightly wrong, as if painted with a thinning brush, and lifted her hand without accusation. Anne watched her point to a spot beneath the floorboards. In one dream, Maria did not speak because she had no breath left to shape words. In another, she spoke Anne's name, and the sound was a moth on glass. The pointer finger never wavered. Beneath, beneath, beneath. The waking world argued for reason. Dreams are the mind's theatre. Grief is a playwright who owns the stage. Anne tried the arguments out loud to make them stronger, but every morning, the image remained, earth packed in a hurry, a mistake in the pattern of floorboards, the surety with which the dead can point to themselves. She insisted, others resisted. It is difficult to kneel on another family's floor, pry the boards, and call it justice. It is difficult to say aloud that the mind can be more than a light in a skull. But finally, there was enough pressure. A few men went with spades. William stayed away. At the Red Barn, they knelt. The dust rose like reluctance. Boards came up with a groan, as if the wood itself had practiced denial. Below, the soil was not what soil should be. It was rearranged, sullen, newly taught to forget. The spades cut. The air changed. A hand appeared first, because hands are always honest. They found the rest with the sickly politeness of discovery. Maria came back the way the earth gives back what it cannot keep. The village stopped speaking in sentences and took up whispers, the kind of low communal hum that sits just under a hymn. William was questioned, at once, and then again. He denied. He denied with the smoothness of someone who had practiced denial as a second tongue. But the village, now carrying the weight of the unearthed, had changed languages too. It used the grammar of look at this. It used the inflections of remember. In the end, William confessed. The words fell out like something that had been hidden in his mouth for too long and had grown teeth. Polstead was left with a new kind of problem. The problem after the problem. The body was buried properly, the confession recorded, the court satisfied, and still the nights shifted. Some said they heard a knocking under their floorboards, a polite, insistent tapping. Some said they saw Maria at the lane's bend, a figure who might be a woman if you wished, and a trick of light if you did not. The barn stood where it had always stood, pretending to be only wood and nail. But a village is a living ledger. It records its debts and finds ways to pay. This story begins with a date and a grave, but it does not end there. It is not one story. It is three, nested like bowls, all within the same field, the same parish map, the same coordinates marked in the corner of old county surveys. The first has been told. A love that was not love. A barn that would not keep a secret. A mother who learned the angle of her daughter's finger in a dream. The second begins when the body is taken up and the law pretends to understand. The third begins when understanding itself is shown to be only another kind of wallpaper paste. Listen closely, because a village is an organism that dreams with many heads, and because sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes, the dead do point. The second story began in the year after, when the Red Barn changed from a place to a place, where something happened. Tourists came with a hunger flatteringly called curiosity. They touched the boards and posed for drawings. Relic hunters peeled chips of wood from the barn's ribs and sold them as if the tree had grown them already famous. Bits of floor became talismans in drawers across Suffolk, hidden among buttons and foreign coins. In fairs, a human skeleton was exhibited beneath a sign painted with words too theatrical to be completely believed. Parents took children to look at a consequence as if it were a lantern show. One wet spring, a storm pressed its palms to the barn and left it listing. The men who fixed it worked slowly, as one does when drilling through rumour. They left with their pockets a little heavier and their sleep a little thinner. One of them, no one remembers his name because anonymous men saddled themselves with history, claimed that, while prying up a damaged board, he found a scrap of fabric snagged underneath. It was red once, perhaps, the sort of red that shouts its colour even when it is quiet. He did not take it to the constable. He took it home and placed it under glass. He told his wife it was nonsense, then admitted to himself that nonsense has its own gravity. He woke to the sound of a footstep in his hallway. He woke to the feeling of a fingertip on his shoulder. Not the pressure of harm, but the pressure of insistence. He returned the fabric to the barn under cover of night, set it back beneath an honest board, and slept like a man on the far side of a debt. As the years turned, the barn drew cataloguers. Men with notebooks and hard boots came to measure angles and annotate the way the doors sagged. Some wrote about the case in pamphlets. Some sold the pamphlets to men who told the story again over ale. The names shifted like handwriting. The dates blurred. But one thing remained. The dreams. Anne Marten aged and waited for a mind to fail that did not fail. They came not every night and not always with alarm, but they arrived with the exactness of a bell. Sometimes Maria stood in the doorway again, pointing, though what lay beneath had already been gathered and wrapped and lowered. Sometimes the dream took the form of sounds, muffled, layered, like voices speaking upstairs in a house that had not been built. Once, only once, Anne dreamed of the barn without boards. It was a skeleton of a building, all ribs and absence, and the ground beneath it was breathing. She woke with her hands clenched as if they had been around something that wanted to get out. There were others. A widow who lived alone at the end of Fen Lane reported that some nights were not quite empty. She would place her cup on the table and sense the air make room for someone else. She was not a fanciful woman. Fanciful women are accused of dreaming for sport. This woman was accused of misplacing her grocery list and then finding it exactly where it should be. She woke sometimes to the smell of turned earth, which would have been troubling even without a famous barn nearby. On a Sunday in October, while passing the barn, she paused to retie a loose bootlace. She glanced up and saw between the slats a white shape hanging like a piece of the sky had been folded wrong. It was fabric, not cloud. It stirred with the breath of the barn. She stood. She listened to the quiet in which there might be a breath. She became, for a moment too long, certain that if she spoke a name, someone would turn a face towards her from the darkness within. She did not speak. She moved on. But that night, the dream visited. A woman points, her finger a compass, her mouth an instruction that never quite arrives. Boys dared each other to run their hands along the barn at midnight. One boy swore that when he placed his palm on the boards, he felt a tapping from within, as if someone at a window on a long train had wanted to be noticed. Another boy laughed too loudly because he had not felt the tapping, and it is terrible to be left out by the unexplainable. In 1842, a traveller passed through with a box under his arm. He paid for a room at the inn and announced that he could take and develop portraits. He wanted to include the barn. He arranged his apparatus, coached a few villagers on the stillness required, and stood in the field with the lens glaring at the structure. One plate failed, then another. The third captured something. A smear where a beam should be, a dark oval where no window existed. He dismissed it as technique. The innkeeper kept the plate. For years, a copy hung behind the bar. People looked and felt thirsty for reasons that did not involve ale. Stories multiplied the way mold does when ignored. There were claims of a whisper at the well that on one winter afternoon said the word beneath and wrapped the syllable in frost. There was the black dog, every English village has one, which appeared gashless and glossy, then vanished, leaving footprints that led, impossibly, toward the barn and under its door as if joints between wood were throat. Time filed down the edges, as it does, until the case was a history and the village was a place again. The barn lived longer than its usefulness, then died. When it was dismantled, there were men who argued that history should not be taken apart. Yet they did it, board by board, as if reversing the dream, as if to say that a room cannot hold two meanings forever. Pieces disappeared. The frame obeyed gravity. The field learned to pretend nothing had ever stood there, but history is better at waiting than people are. A few summers later, on an evening with moths like drifting ash, an elderly man passed the spot and saw, merely for a second, the suggestion of an outline in the air. It was not a ghost in the shape of a girl. It was not even a barn in the shape of an idea. It was the faintest architecture of attention. How the eyes will build something when the mind agrees to see. He took off his hat, not knowing whether the gesture was for the building or for the story inside it. Then he put the hat back on, walked home, and did not tell his wife. But he slept poorly and dreamed not of death, but of pointing, which is a way of living. The second story doesn't end. Not really. It becomes what villagers call only a tale, while continuing to leave fingerprints on the window. After all, the dead do not simply stop being located when we move the boards. They remain with coordinates, longitude of memory, latitude of rumor, and sometimes, very quietly, they choose someone new to look at them. The third story begins in another century. Polstead wears new houses like a borrowed coat. Visitors come because their phones tell them the past lives here. They park, step out, and speak in the polite voices of people who are afraid they might be interrupting something. Some come because history is an aesthetic. Others, because a mother's dream is either the most human mystery in the world or the only one that makes sense. The field where the barn stood is only a field. But fields are libraries. They hold what fell and what was lifted. And then, because they are generous, they let the wind read the pages again and again. A researcher arrived with a recorder, a notebook, and the kind of respectful skepticism that does not talk down to the dead. She had read the accounts. She had traced the old maps with her finger until the ink smudged onto her skin. She rented a room above the inn and asked for tea, as if warming the air were part of her method. She was not there to seek revenge for Maria or to absolve the men who told the story too loudly. She was there because the line between dream and instruction had always drawn her. The line between what can be known and what can be followed. On her first evening, she walked to the field. The sky carried its usual rehearsed sunset. Two blackbirds tangled with each other in a hedge and made a noise like laughter that had snagged on something. She stood where the doorway might have been. "It is a guess," she said aloud. "But a guess can be a bow." She closed her eyes. The wind lifted her hair and set it down again carefully, as if laying a bookmark. The recorder remembered her voice and the shiver of leaves. Later, in the inn, she listened as if the machine might confess something. She heard the near sound of a fly, the far thing that was probably a motor on the B-1066. And then, between breath and breath, a muffled thump. She replayed. The thump returned where it had been. It was nothing, she told herself. It was something, said her skin, in which the hair had learned to suspect. She slept wearing the history like a shawl and woke at 3 o'clock to a dream already disassembling itself. But before the planks fell, she remembered. The barn's doorway. A woman's hand lifted, not like a blessing and not like a warning. A finger pointed down to a place that had no boards. It pointed into the idea of beneath. The sensation was not horror. It was insistence, which is more dangerous. She sat, lit a candle with the match the inn provided for charm, and wrote the dream in block letters as if a court reporter worked inside her. Then she blew out the match and realized her hands were shaking because they believed her job was to help. The next day, she found an elderly woman at the churchyard pruning roses. The woman had a face that remembered more than names. Their conversation walked carefully, as if trying not to disturb bees. When the researcher mentioned the dreams, the older woman met the air between them with a slow nod that belonged to the 19th century. "Land remembers," she said, as if announcing a weather pattern. "We try to put it to sleep with our buildings and our talking, but it remembers. If it wants you to find something, it'll knock." The researcher did not laugh. She noted that the woman's pruning proceeded in a pattern. Always left branch first, then right, then the center, as if the plant had a liturgy. That evening, it rained. Good, honest rain that made the field smell like an old book opened for the first time in decades. The researcher returned to the coordinates. She turned on the recorder and spoke not into the wind, but into whatever listened beyond wind. "I want to understand," she said. "If you want to be found, I will look. If you want to be left, I will leave." The rain pressed the soil as if to say, "Hush." The recorder recorded. She heard nothing then, only Rain's handwriting. But later, in the inn, the sound presented itself. A series of 3 knocks, staircase slow, then silence. Then, just as she began to imagine, a 4th. To be haunted is to be given a task. She returned with permission from the owner of the land, and a way to look shallowly without harm. She did not come to dig. Not deep. Not like the 19th century had dug. She came to read the field as one reads Braille. Gently, with the pads of fingers, with patience. The apparatus was unromantic. Aluminum, plastic, displays like dim eyes. She moved in increments. The device told her where the earth had been moved, not in 1827, too long ago for her tools, but in the decades since, when barns were dismantled and trenches for posts were reconsidered. She found the ghost of an old foundation. She found the line where a hedgerow had been and then had not. She found, surprisingly, a small pocket where the soil sank a little on itself, as if remembering weight. She marked it. She knelt. The rain had softened the top layer, so it gave, politely. 2 inches down, her fingers encountered glass. Not modern, not fresh. Glass with the greenish attitude of a century. She eased it up, the neck of a small bottle. Inside, nothing visible, just the stale smell of old air negotiating its release. She did not open it. She took it to her rented room and laid it on the table like a patient. That night, the dream shifted. It was no longer the doorway. It was a floor without boards, a useful paradox. The finger pointed to the bottle that lay now on the wood near her teacup, and the certainty in the dream had the weight of a municipality. She woke, uncorked the bottle, and right away regretted the speed with which she had obeyed. At first the room received only the breath of the past. Air does have dates. The nose knows it, though we never say so because the mind cannot bear that time has a smell. Then a whisper reached her that was not spoken into the room, but into her bones. 4 words. She did not understand the first 3 fully, but the 4th was clear. Beneath her. The bottle remained empty but complete, like an argument. She placed it back in the rectangle of lamplight as if that could contain it. Sleep avoided her. Dawn arrived with its small, responsible sounds. A bin clattering somewhere, a kettle, a bird whose call was a question that did not wait for an answer. On the following day, she visited the church, not as a believer would, but as a reader does when a text might be annotated. The church kept registers in glass, marriages, burials, christenings. She traced a line with her eyes and found names that had weathered into authority. She found Maria's entry, a date, a confident hand, a line drawn across the margin as if to emphasize the finality. She copied the letters as if they were a number that must be dialed exactly. On her way out, she touched the stone of the doorway with her fingers. There is something about thresholds that trained her to say please. A man approached her then. He introduced himself, an owner of a cottage near the field. His family had been here long enough that the stories fit them like hand-me-down clothes. He carried, rather shyly, a framed photograph. "This hung in the house when I was a child," he said. The photograph was the old copy, the barn, a darkish blur, a framed cloud. He pointed to the unexplained oval. "My mother used to keep a tea towel over it," he admitted, embarrassed by the superstition he could not disentangle from tenderness. "Said it made the house too awake." Too awake. The researcher understood that phrase in the way one understands an ancestor's handwriting. She thanked him, returned the picture, and felt the field behind her like a presence. She walked back to the coordinates and sat because there are investigations that require sitting. She set the bottle in the grass. She said the name Maria once, not as if summoning, but as if acknowledging a door had a name separate from the house. Nothing happened, which is not the same as nothing. When she finally stood, the day had shifted. Shadows learned to speak. She turned to go and felt, lightly, a pressure on her forearm. The way a child might tap you to say, "Don't forget me just because you're thinking." The way a mother might remind you where to look when you cannot find your keys. She pivoted back. The bottle sat where she had placed it. She knelt again and saw, near the bottle, a ripple in the soil's surface, a kind of wrinkle. She touched it. It gave. No more than 2 inches. Beneath, a small space, the kind left by a root long gone. In that space, a sliver of wood waited like a page from a burned book. She lifted it carefully. It was not a board. Not the summer of 1827 turned tangible. It was a piece of something older than the bottle and younger than the tree, carved with a groove not made by insects, and stained with something that had once been red. A relic in the most neutral sense. A remainder. She felt what all human beings feel when the earth gives them a shard, both plagiarist and priest. She put the sliver and the bottle together in her bag and went back to the inn. That night, she slept without dreaming, but the absence had a shape. It made room for something that stood in the corner, a presence that did not want to wear horror. It wanted to wear completion. On the third night, she went to the field already knowing she would speak. "If there is anything left to find," she said, "let it be found by someone who loves you. If what you need is only to be remembered, I am remembering. If what you need is not to be alone." The sentence did not end, because the recorder made a sound that was not itself. It clicked, word, and then produced a single tone that pulled the hair at the nape of her neck as if it had a hand. She looked at its small screen. Numbers counted when they should have held still. The device had entered a mode she had not selected. And then, on the recording later, a voice that could be weaned with consonants said one word clearly enough for a courtroom. "Here. Not beneath. Here." There is a difference. Beneath points to a place that waits. Here points to a place that includes you. The researcher returned to her room and did the foolish thing that might also be the brave thing. She spoke aloud to whatever occupied the space between her and the window. She told the story as it was known. She gave Maria the dignity of being named for the choices she made rather than the crime done to her. She addressed Anne's dreams not as miracles, but as instructions. She said, "If you came to a mother because a mother would listen, I will listen too. If you came to the only person who could command the floor to open, then let me be sent." What arrived then was not a spectre. It was memory organized into a person-shaped form. It was Maria as a fact, her outline filled with what the living had been told and what the dead cannot alter. The researcher did not see a face. She saw the gesture, the pointing, and then, for the first time across nearly 2 centuries, the finger did not point to the ground. It pointed toward the horizon, to the line where fields become distance, to the road that leaves Polstead. The message was not a contradiction. It was a completion. Being found, it implied, is not only about being dug up, it is also about being allowed to leave. The researcher stood before dawn and walked the road out of the village. She carried the bottle in her bag, the sliver of wood wrapped like a child's tooth in a handkerchief. At the lane's bend, she paused because all Polstead stories pause there. A fox crossed with a terrible elegance and did not look back. Something in the world made room for something else, and she understood. She took the bottle to the river. The water received it gratefully, like a letter returned to a postmistress who has been waiting 2 centuries for a forwarding address. She did not throw it. She placed it in a slow eddy and watched it decide. When it bobbed away, it did so with a small sound like, yes. She kept the sliver, not as a trophy, but as a pledge. To talk about Maria in the voice the living deserve. To tell about the barn without stripping it for spectacle. To hold the dream as both grief and instruction. She would write a paper with the dryness it required and then tell the story in a room lit by a single lamp. Because sometimes the past wants formality, and sometimes it wants a human voice practicing the art of recall. Back in the inn she slept. The dream visit stopped. The silence was not empty. It was satisfied. But she woke once to the feeling of someone smoothing the crease in the sheet near her ankle. The gesture was domestic, almost boring, and it filled her with the kind of gratitude that belongs to endings that are not punitive. Before leaving the village for good, she visited the churchyard one last time. She found the older woman pruning roses in the same liturgy, left, right, centre. She told her nothing about bottles or tones or the word here. She simply said, "I think it is done." The older woman nodded, as one nods to rain that finally decides to fall. "Land remembers," she replied, as if the weather had shifted as predicted. On the way out of Polstead, the researcher passed the field. It looked like a field the way a person might look like a photograph of themselves. Real enough to believe, distant enough to forgive. She did not stop. She did not take a picture. She let the road do what roads are for. In the rearview mirror, a horizon line continued to be only a line. Now, consider the 3. In the first, a mother dreams and points the village toward a truth buried beneath boards. In the second, the old structure tries to be a building while the world makes it a mouth for telling. In the third, the past learns a new grammar and speaks not beneath but here. The stories braid into a rope that any village can hold when the wind is too clever. And the rope is not only for Polstead, it is for any place where the earth had to give back a name. Some will say the dreams were imagination, grief taking the shape of instruction because grief, like water, takes the shape of its vessel. Some will say they were a visitation, the dead refusing to be left in the dark, the way a lamp will not agree to be unlit if there is one match in the house. The question, the one that makes the hair bend at the nape and the heart stiffen as if called to stand, remains. Had the mother imagined it? Or had Maria returned, asking to be found? The answer is not a door that opens, but a corridor one walks. A mother dreaming is a house where a child still moves from room to room. A field remembering is a library in mud and roots. A finger pointing is the purest shape of desire. Look here, look directly at this, and in the looking, do not look away, because looking away performs a kind of burial too. This much is certain. After the bottle, after the sliver, after the word here, the researcher did not dream again of pointing. But she did, sometimes, while washing dishes or standing at a bus stop or waiting for her keys to announce themselves, feel a pressure at the edge of the world. Not a shove, not even a touch. The kind of presence that corrects your posture. And when she felt it, she found herself turning, not down to the ground, but outward, toward the unnamed distance, and saying quietly into the day, I see you. And somewhere, in whatever geography contains the dead, someone who once stood in a barn and lifted her hand was finally able to lower it. Is the story over? Stories like this do not conclude. They bank, they circle back, they learn to land. Visitors still come to Polstead in October, when the sun deceives at 4 in the afternoon and the grass begins to negotiate. They bring their phones because they believe that capturing is comprehending. They step onto the field and wait for strangeness as if it were a polite dog. Most of them feel nothing. Some of them feel an ache behind their eyes, as if remembering a name that refuses to surface. Sometimes someone will say aloud to the empty coordinates, if you are there, and the wind will answer in its old vocabulary, and that will be enough. Enough because the dead have done their pointing, and the living have learned to read other kinds of indications. A kettle left warm, a chair pushed in, a sense that beneath is not the only direction loss demands. If you ever go, because people do, because humans measure their own hearts against the past like tailors, do not peel bark, do not pocket dirt. Stand where the doorway might have been, and hold your hands exactly at your sides. Then listen, not for knocks or words, but for the silence after a child has been found and the house settles. It is a silence with edges softened by touch. It is the absence of absence. It is, properly understood, a door held open. Lock your doors. Put on your headphones. Because after this story, you may never again think of dreams as merely the daily static of an untidy mind. You may come to suspect they are small lanterns hung by the hands of those who cannot bear to be unfound. And if one night you wake and find yourself standing at a window with the certainty that someone requires your attention, consider the angle of your finger. Consider the words you may be called to say, either beneath or here. And when morning comes and you tell yourself the reasonable things, remember the unreasonable too. Remember the village that became a ledger. Remember a barn that was not read and then was read again in the telling. Remember that a mother dreamed and saved a daughter from the deepest oblivion we have, to vanish without witness. The field waits, it always will. But perhaps, at last, it is waiting not for a spade, not for boards to be lifted, not for a court to declare anything, Perhaps it is waiting for the living to let the dead lower their hands, and for the living, brave for once, to raise theirs in answer not to accusation, but to acknowledgement, to say aloud in a lane where skylarks practice their lies, I have seen where you pointed, I will carry the rest. If that is the ending, it does not close the book. It lays it open under a window so the light can change the ink. It says, we found you, Maria. We have not forgotten. And when we dream of pointing, it is not always because the earth is hiding something. Sometimes it is because the horizon is trying to teach us how to look.